Bienvenidos a este tercer panel sobre cobertura en la niñez y, si es posible, un sistema universal. Bueno, creo que de lo que viene desde hoy a la mañana es el más internacional de todos esta dimensión. Es un placer estar acá con panelistas de primer nivel. Voy a presentar primero a Olli Kangas de Finlandia. Olli es doctor en Sociología y Política Social de la Universidad de Helsinki. Cuenta con más de 10 años como líder del equipo de investigación de Kela, que es el Instituto de Seguridad Social de Finlandia. Además es profesor de la Universidad de Turku y del Consejo de Investigación Estrategia de la Academia de Finlandia. Y dentro de Kela, como les contaba, que es el Instituto de Seguridad Social de Finlandia, él está a cargo del proyecto de investigación sobre el ingreso básico universal, UBI, por sus siglas, en el que 2.000 personas desempleadas de distintos contextos socioeconómicos de Finlandia recibieron un ingreso no condicionado mensual durante 2 años, años 2016 y 2017. La idea hoy justamente es que Olli nos cuente sobre la experiencia de esta prueba, especie de prueba piloto con el ingreso básico universal. Así que bueno, vamos a darle la palabra.
Okay. Very fine. Wow. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. And why I'm standing is not that I'm turning back to you, and it has nothing to do with dislike of you. I like you much, but I'm speaking better when I'm standing. So thank you. Unfortunately enough, my lingual limitations, I'm obliged to speak in English, and I hope that everything will go smoothly, despite the fact that I'm not speaking Spanish. So it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here, because I'm one of the most eager supporters of the football national team of Argentina. And Messi especially is my favorite, like he's also a favorite of my daughter, who is an active football player. And she has a dog, and the name of the dog is Messi, because it's small and very rapid. And she was living in the UK, and she asked from her landlady, is it possible to take my dog with me? And the landlady asked, which kind of dog do you have? It's Messi, said my daughter. And the landlady had said that, no, we can't have Messi dogs here. So that's just a start. There should be at least one joke in a good speech, said somebody that was there. Or it was a fact. There are lots of places for jokes. Okay, conditionalities in universal benefits. I say something about the background of the Finnish experiment, and that's why, because the Finnish experiment is done in the Finnish context, and every single country is unique. And what I'm now saying to you, it means that those Finnish experiences are not possible to imitate in any other country, because the Finnish case is special, Argentine case is special, the US case is special, so that we have to make our decisions good or bad and try to find our own institutional solutions. And then I'll say something about the basic income experiment, and then there are lots of recurring questions posed to me, and I'm supposed to answer, I suppose, to those questions here. So that let's see what I can do in 45 minutes. Usually the rock star is saying that if you give me 5 minutes on electricity, then you are making me famous. Let's see what I can do with my 45 minutes and electricity. So, if we first start with conditionalities in different countries, here this picture depicts how conditionalities in social assistance figure out in some European countries. In the vertical axis, there's a maximum cut percentage, how much the minimum benefit can be cut down in the case that the client doesn't behave. If she is behaving badly, in that case, some countries she can lose 100% of the benefit, all of it means. And in some countries the cutting percent is much less, like in Switzerland less than 20%, and in Finland 40%, whereas for example in Ireland, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, Bulgaria, Portugal, UK, you can lose everything if you don't behave. So that's one aspect of conditionality. And then the duration of the cuts presented in the horizontal axis in weeks. For example, in the UK, you can lose everything for 3 years. Whereas in Finland, you can lose 40% of your basic benefit for 4 weeks. So that in the Finnish case, we can conclude that it's conditional, that it's not that conditional as the benefits, basic benefits and basic social assistance benefits are, for example, in the UK and many other European countries. So this is one background that universal basic discussion in Finland and in some other European countries. And then to say something about the universal Finnish social policy, the national pensions were instituted very early, and then child allowances that are universal, so that everybody or every child that is below 17 years of age will get benefit, irrespective of family situations. And the level for the first child is something like 95%, and then for the second child 105%, etc., as depicted in the right-hand side, indicating that there's a kind of pro-natalistic element baked in the Finnish child allowance system. And also it has something to do with that in Finland, especially families with many children are exposed to poverty, and in that case it's motivated, or the motivation is why to have higher benefit, for example, for the fourth child, 173 euros. And then in the unemployment benefit system we have dual system, so that there's income-related benefit available for those who have income from employment prior to unemployment, and then basic unemployment system available for those who had no income previously when they became unemployed, so that it's a kind of basic income for the unemployed persons. And if you go back to that picture, very often people have asked that the government implement basic income in Finland, and I have said that we already have basic income, a kind of basic income system there, because our constitution says that in the case that people don't have anything else, in that case she must be paid the minimum social assistance. And if she's not behaving, saying that I don't want to work, I just want to be home, in that case she will get 40%, 60% of the basic social assistance, despite the fact of her misbehavior, so that it's already there. And then what I think what is interesting in the Finnish case is that we have something that's called baby box. And that baby box thing is something that's traveling pretty much. It was instituted 48, and there's everything newborn child will need during the first year. And so you see a happy family throwing out all those things that are in that baby box. And in most cases, babies are sleeping in those boxes because there are mattresses and all things that are needed for babies to sleep. For example, me, I began my life sleeping till the first year of my life. And once I was presenting this in the UK, and then they asked that there's a lock on that box, and they asked that when the baby is sleeping there, do you use that lock and put the lock? And I said that no, only in that case that families are not satisfied with the newborn, they can put the lock on and return the child, because we have strong protection laws in Finland that if the customer is not satisfied, he can return the thing. So, but this is something that has traveled, so that in many African countries they are taking, in Scotland they took it in use I was consulted very many times from the Scotland side, and they wanted to introduce that. And that's actually pretty good in that sense that it's unconditional, but it's conditional. So that the pregnant mother must participate in medical screening, meet medical doctors, and meet midwife regularly during her pregnancy. And it means that there's a medical consultation going on all the time. And every child will be, have already, when they are in the stomach, or the moms or the mothers, they will get the medical treatment. So that in that case, I think that that's a good idea. So something like that. Then something about the effectiveness of the Finnish and the Nordic universal child allowances and more conditional housing allowances and that kind of benefits that are coming on top of that universalism. The poverty rates in the Nordic hemisphere are very, very low in the global perspective. If you look at the left-hand side of the picture, we have the all Nordics there, and it's an indication that the policies that are applied in the Nordic countries, they are pretty effective in eliminating childhood poverty. At least if you use this kind of measurement that they use in Luxembourg income study. And unfortunately enough, I don't have figures, or they don't have figures in Luxembourg income study for Argentina for now, but it had been nice to know and have Argentina also here. So that in some Southern American countries are doing rather well, like Guatemala, Uruguay, Chile, and some others are not doing that well. Then the basic income experiment in Finland. We studied 4 different models in the very beginning. The first one was a full basic income compensating and replacing almost all other income transfer schemes, and the level was something like 1,000 euro, 1,500 euros. But the problem was that it was not realistic, because the taxation rate to finance it had been something like 70–80% of that income that's coming on top of basic income, so that it was not that realistic. We concluded on the basis of micro-simulations. And then we had negative income taxation, but we had to abandon it and roll it out because we don't have income registers that are working on a monthly or daily basis. We have registers that are working on an annual basis, and it's not good enough for that kind of experiment. From the beginning of next year, we will have income register that is updated so that it's working on the weekly basis. And it means that then we had this kind of negative income tax in our hands. And then other models, participation income. The problem was that what is the participation that should be paid for? So that who defines what is participation, how much should be paid for that, etc., etc. So that then we had the partial basic income, 550 euros there. And then, how many minutes? 15 minutes, wow. So then I will say something about the European Commission and the European level of protection. Because Finland is a member of the European Union, as you perhaps know. Then in the very beginning, when we began to plan this experiment, we had to think what the European Union will say about it. If basic income is portable benefit from Finland. Portable benefit within the European Union means that if somebody, for example, in Romania comes to Finland, lives there a couple of months and then moves back to Romania, can she take the money with her or not? And then it came out that 560 euros is a critical level, that all benefits that are below that 560 euros, they are financed through taxes, and in that case they are not portable. If they are financed through taxes, they are not portable, but immediately when there are social security contributions giving an owner right to that benefit, in that case, they can take it with them and run. So that this is just an example how difficulty to plan a national, that kind of national policy, a very, how to say, innovative idea, but we don't have any experiences in the European Union. And then the question is that, is it a national question or is it a European Union question? What Finland or some other national country can do without taking into consideration that the European level? And my answer is that not that much. And when it comes to the implementation of basic income in Finland, I think that this is a very critical question, that what the European level decision-making and legislation will say about that. That is something that I think is very, very interesting and important question. So then what the basic income experiment is about in Finland. We are paying unconditionally 560 euros net a month, and then all other social benefits, in the case that the client is getting something more than 560 euros, it's floating on top of that, so that it's 500 euros and plus something else. And work income will float on the basic income. It means that if the guy who is getting basic income will find employment, in that case there will be salary plus 560 euros, or if the client is happy with 560 euros and will stay at home, she can stay at home without doing anything. And we have 2,000 unemployed people who are getting flat rate benefit from Kela, or were getting flat rate benefit in the end of 2016. We took a random sampling, nationwide random sampling from that, and then to those 2,000 happy people, or unhappy, I don't know, usually happy people, they were getting that 560 euros. And the participation was obligatory, so that they had no possibility to say, no, I don't want to be a part of this experiment. They had to. And it's good in that sense that it's a very strong experiment in that sense that we have obligatory participation and we can avoid selection bias that is always there in the case that we have voluntary participation. And then we have that treatment group of 2,000 people, and then we have control group that in the very beginning were precisely identical with the experimental group, and we know that if there are differences in the end of the experiment, then the differences are caused by the treatment, so that it's causally rather strong experiment, despite the fact that 2,000 people and 2 years in the experimentation are too little. But anyway, I'm satisfied with the research design, obligatory, random, and nationwide, but I'm not that happy with the other aspects of the experiment. And we will do studies on the results of the experiment by using registers. We have good registers in Finland. We can follow people, which kind of employment they have, which kind of money they are getting from their employment, which kind of medicine they are eating, which kind of medical diagnosis they have, and we can compare the groups with each other on the basis of registers. But the problem is that registers are lagging behind, so that the data for 2017 is ready in December this year, so that we will get data for the whole experiment first in the end of 2019. But we are just now we are running a survey that was fielded a week ago. So in the beginning of this week we started interviewing people by telephone. There are 2,000 people in the experimental group and 8,000 people in the control group that will be called up, and we will ask lots of questions about well-being and why they choose to do this and that, they instead of this and that, and which kind of feelings they have on bureaucracy, etc., etc. And then there will be later face-to-face interviews with 30 people in the experimental group and 30 people in the control group. Then there were some critical questions posed to me about the evaluation and triggering questions How the sample was chosen and recruited, I already answered. And what are the main results of the pilot test? Not yet results. The first results will be there in the beginning of next year, and I would be happy if you invite me once again to tell about those results in 2 months' time, to be here once again in your beautiful city. And how was it founded? The government said that they will reserve 20 million euros for the experiment. We in the research group we try to say that it should give 100 millions for us. In that case, we will make a very, very proper and excellent experiment for you. But is there any politician here? Hand up. So so perhaps I dare to say, I perhaps is faster runner than you. So that sometimes politicians are not totally understandable, to put it beautifully. And they didn't understand why they should give, instead of scanty 20 millions, 100 millions to us. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of the universal system instead of means testing? In means testing, at least in the Finnish case, it's very difficult to say who will be eligible or not. And especially in this time, in modern time, when we don't have that kind of family situations as we used to have, so that there can be, let's say, children from 3 different marriages in the very same household, and then it's very difficult to define which kind of household income we have to take into consideration. And so it's much easier to make things universal. And that problem of defining who deserves this and that was behind the universalism of our child allowance system, because we had one that was conditional and means tested. It was started in 1937, but very soon the government realized that okay, it's impossible to say and draw a line that those people deserve the money and those families don't deserve. So that it was a kind of motivation of easing the bureaucracy. And for example, they have a basic income experiment running in the Netherlands, and they are saying that the previous system where social assistance was conditional. It was very difficult for the municipalities to evaluate and screen the income and what people are doing, and therefore they are now experimenting with unconditional social assistance, just to avoid this kind of bureaucracy, what is usually linked with the targeted benefits. And then also there are differences between the mode of production, so that at least in the Finnish case, our social security was constructed during the industrial era. And very often it showed that those social policy systems that were built up then, they don't anymore respond to those digital economy and platform economy mode of employment, so that they can anymore answer to those social questions and social problems that are created by digitalization. So that that's why more universal systems are better to my mind. And also universal systems, they usually enjoy better legitimacy, at least in the Finnish case. Everybody participates in financing and everybody gets something. But of course, there is place for targeted benefits. For example, in the Finnish case, housing allowances and very many other income-related benefits are not means tested, but they are tested against income from employment. So how does the universal basic income impact on behavior or formal employment? I think that it will increase formal employment as it did in some experiments in other countries like India and some African countries, and also in the US and Canada they did. And actually in the US and Canada, the labor market behavior changed among the mothers and among youngsters. And that was said that it's a failure of basic income because the labor supply among women and among young males decreased. But there's a rather logical reason why it did so. So that the mothers stayed longer with their babies, and then the males, young males, they stayed longer in the education and took their exams there. And that was the reason, not the bad reason, I think. And then impact on children, probably the impact is positive, at least in the Indian experiment and in some African experiments and in some other experiments conducted in developing countries and developing economies, so that children had better nutrition and better health conditions within that experimental group, that in the control group. And then the critical point is that how does the basic income impact on productivity? It remains to be seen that there are lots of critical economists that are saying that people, in the case that people are getting free money, in that case they are getting lazy. But we will see what will happen there. And then what impact does the universal basic income have gender equality? Opinions differ when it comes to the case of Finland, but for example, if I refer once again to some Indian and some African experiments, the female empowerment and power of women increased incredibly because they got their own money and they were not anymore that dependent on their husbands. And that was one reason why, for example, divorce rate increased in the US when they had those experiments there, so that women got more freedom to say their own wills. And then finally, has the Finnish government consider implementing unconditional social policy? No. We already now have a rather unconditional social policy, and the government, the present government wants to make it more conditional. In the very beginning I showed you a picture about the cuts and in social assistance, and the government that is said, the right government just now in Finland, they will introduce harsher policies so that the loss of benefit would be greater, and also they will be stronger if the government succeeds. Stronger employment requirement and lots of other behavioral requirements to get the full benefit. So very many questions are still open, and as I said that in a couple of months I'm a little bit wiser and tell something more about it, and I'm very much hoping for invitation once more. Thank you.
Un placer escuchar la presentación. Vamos a dar lugar ahora a la siguiente, de Nad Hubrets, de Sudáfrica. Él es máster en Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de las Naciones Unidas, es el asesor principal de política social del Instituto de Investigación de Política Económica de Sudáfrica. Se especializa en el diseño e implementación de políticas y programas de protección social. Cuenta con una vasta experiencia en investigación, asesoramiento sobre políticas en varios países de África y de Asia, y también como consultor para distintos organismos internacionales y agencias gubernamentales. Recientemente escribió el Marco de Protección Social de Tanzania, hizo aportes para el desarrollo de la Estrategia de Protección Social de la India y realizó las evaluaciones de varios programas, incluidos programas de Camboya, Bangladesh, Sudáfrica y Uganda. Actualmente NARD está liderando el diseño, implementación y evaluación de varios programas de transferencias monetarias en Nigeria, Kenia y Gambia. Bueno, y ahora queremos escuchar lo que tiene para contarnos sobre el programa de Sudáfrica, de Child Support Grant. Bueno.
Perfect. Thank you very much. After hearing from friends in countries with conditional systems, I'm happy to bring also the unconditional voice and a practical example of how countries also employ unconditional programs to fight poverty. I work for an institute in South Africa called the Economic Policy Research Institute. And in 1994, after apartheid, although, as already was introduced, since we've sort of expanded beyond the borders of South Africa, but in 1994, since 1994, we've been working with the government to expand South Africa's system of social protection to where it is today. And I think whether it's academics, NGOs, whether it's think tanks, whether it's large development organizations such as World Bank, such as UNICEF, I think many of us agree that the story of South Africa and social protection is a story of success. And today I want to zoom in a little bit on that success story. And I want to zoom in especially on the role of social grants and the role of rights protection in that system of social grants, to understand the success of the system. So, first of all, given that our government representative unfortunately couldn't make it, let me give you a bit of a background about South Africa's social protection system. So, comprehensive social protection is a pillar in the National Development Plan of South Africa, consisting of social assistance, social security, labor market policies, amongst others. Probably most lauded is South Africa's system of social grants. So South Africa has 7 social grants, of which the biggest 6 I've listed here, because the 7th one is very tiny. There's 3 grants targeting children, and there's 3 grants targeting the adult population. The biggest grant by far, targeting about 12.5 million children, is the child support grant, and it gives about $28, depending on the exchange rate, each month to the caregivers of children up to the age of 18. It's not universal, it's targeted. The second one is foster child care grant. So if you have a child in foster care, you get a grant, given to about 0.4 million beneficiaries. And the last grant for children is the care dependency grant. And basically it's a grant for children with extreme severe disabilities. And it targets about 100,000 children. South Africa has also 3 grants for adult population. The first one, and the biggest one, is the older persons grant. Basically a social pension, given to targeted participants, targeted beneficiaries, over the age of 60. For men, for women, same eligibility thresholds. And it has about 3.4 million beneficiaries. The disability grant takes over from where the care dependency grant stops. And from when the child turns 18, the child with the disability becomes eligible for the disability grant, targeting over 1.1 beneficiaries. And the last grant is a grant in aid, and that one is given to individuals and households that struggle to meet their basic needs at that point in time. Now, South Africa's system of social assistance is generous, is relatively generous. For instance, the older persons grant, this $120 a month, is about 200% of the national poverty line. South Africa's social assistance system benefits 2 in every 3 South Africans. 2 in every 3 South Africans live in a household that has a social grant beneficiary living in it. Its commitment to social assistance is not only reflected in these grants, it's also very much reflected in the share of GDP it allocates to their system of social assistance, to these grants. Over 3.5% of GDP. And the largest grant, budget-wise, is the older persons grant. But definitely the flagship program within this system of grant is the child support grant. So the child support grant is implemented since 1997. So apartheid fell in 1994, and since 1997, the child support grant has been implemented. Today, 3 out of 4 children in South Africa are eligible for the child support grant. That's a huge number, targeting over 12.5 million beneficiaries. So the child support grant was very much sort of the first change in social policy in South Africa, in the post-apartheid era. And the legislative framework for the child support grant is enshrined in the South African Constitution. as it states in section 27.1, every South African citizen has a right to social security and a right to social assistance. And it doesn't only stop there, because section 27.2 continues afterwards and state that South Africans don't only have that right, but the state has a responsibility to ensure that those rights are progressively realized. So when the ILO started talking about progressive realization of social protection in the early 2000s, South Africa was already talking about it in 1994. Now, if that's it, it's still not it. The section afterwards speaks to even more attention being given to children and their rights to social services. So, the child support grant ultimately is the government's primary tool to fulfill these rights. And through its implementation, basically the government acknowledges that it has a responsibility to offer immediate relief to children to have their basic needs met. Ultimately, the child support grant is in response to child poverty, despite, as you will see later, all the developmental outcomes the program also has. So initially it was introduced in 1997 for all children up to the age of 6. And it only targeted about 22,000 children in the beginning. But the successful relaxation of the age eligibility, reforms to other eligibility requirements, and an improvement in the targeting mechanism are underlying the successful expansion to these 12.5 million children. So the program is means tested, meaning that only those on incomes below a certain level get the grant. And between 1997 and 2008, this means test was not adjusted, which led to more and more poor beneficiaries ultimately being excluded because they had wage inflation, despite having lower purchasing power. But in 2008, this woman, Margaret from the Eastern Cape, took the Minister of Social Development to court and argued that if you want to fulfill those rights, we have to index the means test and the benefit level. The court mandated government to adjust the means test, and the means test increased with a factor of 10. The other real success in making sure that we lower exclusion errors is that previously the government wanted beneficiaries to come to them to apply for the program. But early on it realized that if we want to make the program a success, we need to reach out to them. So proactive outreach strategies instead of on-demand registration ultimately led from exclusion errors going down from 80% to as low as 17% today. And the great thing is, the exclusion errors are actually a bit higher amongst those that are moderately poor, because they often live in urban areas. For the extreme poor, take-up rates are sometimes as high as 92%. Now, this successful expansion did come, of course, at an extra cost, but not as an extra cost as the total share of government revenue, because throughout this period, South African tax revenue mobilization increased tremendously. Now, very briefly to the impacts. The impacts are plentiful. First of all, looking sort of at the primary objective, the child support grant reduces the poverty gap. That's the difference between the income of a beneficiary living in poverty and the poverty line. It reduces the average poverty gap with 50%. Now, South Africa's entire system of social grants is even more successful. It reduces the entire poverty gap with 67%. The program also has very important secondary outcomes. For instance, on education, and especially girls that are living in beneficiary households are much more likely to go to school than girls that for some reason do not get the grant and live in the same socioeconomic circumstances. There's positive impacts on nutrition too. We see that children that receive the child support grant grow up healthier, turn out to be taller than their peers who do not receive the child support grant. And contrary to what we think, there are productive impacts of the child support grant too. If we compare adults living in recipient households with adults living in households with similar socioeconomic characteristics, but that for some reason are not receiving the child support grant because they're excluded, we see that recipient households are much more likely to look for work and also more likely to succeed in finding work. So the child support grant, like other social grants, conditional or unconditional, does not increase dependency. Another thing it also doesn't increase is fertility. It's the opposite. We see, for instance, that what Alexander already told is that teenage pregnancies go down, and that the spacing between the first and the second child also increases, which is of course beneficial to the child, less competition with your siblings. So also over there we see productive impacts. Now, for me personally, and also for the government, what's a very important impact that the child support grant also has, and which made the child support grant, as a result of this impact, a pillar in the government's fight against HIV and AIDS, was that for the most vulnerable group to the disease, adolescent girls, it saw that girls are less likely to be engaged in transactional sex, less likely to be engaged in cross-generational sex. So really positive outcomes for these girls and for the country when it comes about the fight against HIV. So overall, positive impacts, and these positive impacts all together make that even in times of crisis, for instance here in 2014, even in times of crisis, the government is committed to social assistance. Because it understands that many of the small towns in South Africa depend on the social grants for their consumption. And if we want to sustain domestic consumption, which is an engine in the economy, we need to sustain social assistance. Just to give you an indication, in 2014, the amount of money in times of crisis that South Africa pumped into social assistance extra due to the inflation correction, just that inflation correction was as much as Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, spends in total on social protection. So we're committed to social assistance. Now, so that debate about whether conditions or whether the program is an expenditure or whether it's an investment has been settled a long time ago. So the only debate that still flares up occasionally is this question around whether conditions are required to sustain program impacts. Now, with all these impacts, we perhaps thought maybe this debate has been settled a long time ago. But in 2009, we had a change in government, and with that change in government came a change of heart. And actually, despite the fact that it was an unconditional program at first, the government proposed in an amendment to the Social Assistance Act to make the program conditional. Now, let me say first that in 1997, when we started the program, it started off as a conditional program. But the government in 1997 understood that the conditions discriminate against the very poor it wants to achieve. And those discrimination are often a result of these structural disadvantages imposed on the poor as a result of apartheid. Either way, there was huge backlash amongst society, and government had to weaken the amendment. So today, the program isn't conditional, but it's, as Alexander said, it's linked, whatever you may call it. Because it says that it should be noted that the intentions of the child support grant is to ensure that children attend and complete schooling, and that parents have to produce for children between the age of 7 and 18 a certificate. However, and this is the important point, failure to produce a certificate or failure to attend school will not result in the refusal to pay the child support grant. And actually, if you ask many beneficiaries, maybe they're not even aware of this amendment. I wasn't for a very long time. And actually, when you go to the website of the South African Social Security Agency, sort of the ANSES of South Africa, there's no mention at all to these perceived soft conditionalities. So, why did the government change its stance? We target as civil society being, as public debate being, government through two avenues. The first one being the courts. And in the courts, civil society argued, if you have a right to social protection, can you condition that right? Can you condition a right? And the answer, the court said very clearly, is no. So the government was mandated to change. However, perhaps what was most important was the avenue that we took through the public debate. And in the public debate, the questions that we looked upon to see whether conditions made sense, yes or no, in South Africa were the following. So, what would be the value of a condition? Would conditions drive impacts? Can what we want to achieve as South Africa even be achieved by conditions? And could there be a potential downside to the condition? So, let's have a look at how we went about these debates. So, the difference between conditional and unconditional programs in theory is actually quite clear. They both deliver cash. Conditional, unconditional programs both deliver cash. They both lead to, as we saw in the case of Brazil, Mexico, lead to developmental outcomes that we're looking for. They both can be accompanied by proactive strategies of governments to make sure that beneficiaries spend the money on the intended outcome, whether it's through conditions or whether it's through mobilization